Followers of mine will know that I live in Manchester. I'm based in the north, and one of the areas around Manchester is Oldham. And Oldham has got a theatre, or it had a theatre called the Coliseum. Now, it's around 130 years old, the Oldham Coliseum Theatre, and it's basically had the who's who of northern acting alumni make its way through the theatre over the past 130 years. We've had Charlie Chaplin, Bernard Cribbins, Christopher Eccleston, Maxine Peake, Suranne Jones, Sarah Lancashire, a bunch of Coronation Street actors as well. Loads of great big names have made their way through the Coliseum Theatre. And a couple of nights ago, they had their final show as the curtain closed on the Oldham Coliseum, seemingly forever. Here's a BBC News article, Historic Theatre stages final act after funding cut. This is a report from Ian Youngs. An emotional night of performances and tributes led by actors Maxine Peake and Christopher Eccleston has brought down the final curtain on Oldham's Coliseum Theatre after more than 135 years. Hundreds of audience members packed the venue for its highly charged last show. It has closed after having its Arts Council England, the ACE, having its funding removed. Eccleston had a few things to say. He also performed a scene with Maxine Peake, an excerpt from the new adaptation of the Ken Loach film I, Daniel Blake. They were going to be doing a stage production of I, Daniel Blake in the summer at the Oldham Coliseum. However, those plans have been scuppered because they were given a few weeks' notice and the theatre closed the other day. It closed last week. I would honestly kill to watch Christopher Eccleston perform an adaptation of I, Daniel Blake. It's a brilliant film and he's a brilliant actor. Christopher Eccleston has been making the rounds over the past few days for BBC Breakfast and also BBC Radio 4. I'm going to play the BBC Breakfast clip first.
If you were watching us yesterday, you know that we were looking ahead to a very sad moment in the history of British theatre. It's the closure of Oldham Coliseum after 138 years. So that was the moment that the curtain came down for the last time to a packed theatre after actors past and present graced the stage for one final performance.
Talk to one of those actors who was there for that final performance, Christopher Eccleston, who joins us this morning. Chris, good morning to you and thank you for taking the time to talk to us. Just give us a feeling, if you can, of your emotions last night.
I think I've said in other interviews that actors' emotions are not important. What's important is the borough and town of Oldham and what it's lost, and what we hope to re-establish there. The Arts Council have said that within 3 years we'll have a new theatre, and that's what last night was about. Because a lot of people have lost their jobs. Oldham is responsible for about 20% of employment in the region. So it's not just actors, it's stage managers, it's technicians, it's ushers, a lot of people, a lot of redundancies there. It was a celebration of the amazing achievements, and it just kind of demonstrated exactly what Oldham has lost and what theatre means to the Northwest. So I was very proud to be part of it.
And what did the Oldham Coliseum mean to you? Just explain the role it played in your early career.
Oldham Coliseum, places like the Oldham Coliseum, Duke's Playhouse, Lancaster, Bolton Octagon. When you grow up on a council estate, in 64 in my case, I'm an old timer now, I didn't really feel that acting and painting and poetry belonged to me. What Oldham Coliseum did, because I visited it as a child and as a young person when I was studying acting, it kind of argued against that. It was a beacon for people like me that said, this does belong to you. You can see plays in your own accent. You can see plays by local writers, and you have something to contribute. And that's now disappeared from Oldham. So I worry about the younger generation. It's a lot more difficult to get into the arts professions, as we know. And in an era of supposedly levelling up, it was a devastating decision.
Christopher, good morning. It's Naga here. Do you think Oldham Coliseum, up until yesterday, was still doing that? Was still offering that chance for actors of this generation?
Yeah, the facts speak for itself. I mean, what it was doing about unifying the community is unarguable. There's a large South Indian community there. There's a Roma community there. It's not just what you see on the stages. There are things going on backstage, community projects, and they work with both those groups. So that at a time of great division, what what places like Oldham Coliseum do is they're a kind of a community centre, and they bring people together. And again, Oldham is now without that. So there's a lot of invisible work that goes on, apart from, the starry first nights and the history of Charlie Chaplin and various other people, other actors. So all that is lost as well.
So what happened? Why is Oldham Coliseum being shut down despite such a massive pedigree of talent that's made its way through the alumni and also 130 years worth of history? So Arts Council England are responsible for a lot of the funding for the UK's creative endeavours. They've got a yearly budget of roughly £450 million. That's the ACE's annual budget. However, there was an issue with Oldham Coliseum where it was considered to be a risky investment. It's going to be risky to finance the Oldham Theatre because, during cost of living, things are more expensive. People aren't going to the theatre as often. People are making more difficult decisions. However, what's interesting about the Oldham Coliseum Theatre is that in order to the price for the investment was meant to be around £600,000 a year for 3 years, totaling £1.8 million worth of investment in the near future of Oldham Coliseum. And ACE said, you know what, we're not going to do that. Instead, we're going to close the Oldham Coliseum. We can't fund it anymore. We're going to close it down. And what we're going to do is instead, we're going to give that money to artistic causes in Oldham generally. Oldham Council are also saying that they're going to put together a £26 million new performance space in Oldham as well to sort of fill in the void there. However, there's an awful lot of additional societal, socio-economic context here. If you're looking at this from outside of the UK, firstly, hello, howdy partner, rootin' tootin'. But basically, when it comes to the UK, there's a big cultural creative divide. You've got the north and the south of England, aka London and everywhere else. Now, London has a big thriving theatre media community, but outside of London, it's a lot harder to come around. And there's a lot more grassroots efforts and a lot more community organising, especially in places like Birmingham, in Manchester, Lincolnshire, places outside of London. So what's interesting, though, when it comes to the Oldham Coliseum is that Christopher Eccleston makes a very good argument in another interview, which I'll play in a minute, is that if Oldham, with this massive lineage behind it, if that can be taken down, then, basically no theatre in the UK is safe. Is it 90% of the UK's media made out of London and Manchester? I don't know that statistic. That wouldn't surprise me, though. Now, what's interesting, Eccleston in that interview, he mentions why they're closing this theatre when the UK should be levelling up, and he's absolutely right. And also, I think that the ACE, the Arts Creative England, and the UK government, who of course funds ACE as well, contributes to the funding, that they ignore the north at their own peril, more or less, because in London, everyone's being priced out of working there. Everything's so expensive, it's too expensive to live there. You can't really properly start and raise a family in London. Basically, you work in London for a few years, then you move back up north when you want to start a family because it's too expensive. The bubble is essentially bursting in London. There's so many TV productions that are making their way out of London because it's much cheaper. Birmingham is actually seeing the building and development of a brand new movie studio under Peaky Blinders showrunner Stephen Knight, which is awesome stuff. So why are they trying to ignore other artistic endeavours in the north? And there is a massive class divide to this thing as well. Christopher Eccleston was interviewed for the BBC Radio 4 Today programme. This is on the BBC Sounds. There's like a full 20-minute interview. Here's a short snippet from it, though, and I just want to listen to this because it's a really interesting chat.
The Oldham Coliseum, probably about 15 miles from where I was born and brought up. I went to see productions there as a child, as a young person. I think it's tragic that Oldham and its borough is losing a theatre in a time when we're supposed to be levelling up. And what last night was about was beginning a campaign to establish a new theatre in Oldham, and also to say this can't happen anywhere else, because the question in my mind is if they can get rid of Oldham Coliseum, which has been there for over 100 years, where's next for the Northwest? Because if you grow up in the Northwest, you don't feel the culture and the arts belong to you. You don't believe, if you come from a council estate, that you can be an actor or a poet or a painter. So places like Oldham Coliseum, Bolton Octagon, they're a beacon for people like me. I wouldn't be an actor if it wasn't for Oldham Coliseum, places like that, and they're disappearing. So what happens to the next generation? The next generation of Chris Ecclestons or Maxine Peaks or whoever you want to name. And it's not just what Oldham Coliseum does on its stages. You know, in the past few years, they've done various community projects with the South Indian population that's well established in Oldham, and also the Roma community, also theatres. They end up being community centres, places where people can meet and mingle and exchange differences, if they like. You know, society's becoming increasingly polarised, and there's increasing division around the Northwest in communities, and theatres fight against that. So last night for me was about saying no more starvation of the arts in the Northwest, and when are we getting a new theatre for Oldham?
He mentions that new theatre for Oldham, and we'll elaborate a little bit more on that. So there's the £1.8 million worth of funding for the Oldham Coliseum that was denied, and apparently what's going to be happening in place of that is that Oldham is going to be receiving that £1.8 million, the council is going to be receiving that money to put towards artistic creative endeavours in the community. And that doesn't make an awful lot of sense to me, because if it's not a fact that, we can't afford the upkeep of the Coliseum Theatre, it's the fact, we have the money, it's here, we're willing to give it to Oldham and the community, but we're going to give it to the council instead of Oldham Coliseum. However, the Oldham councillors have openly said that we don't know what to do with this money. People have outspokenly said through Oldham Council that we would rather it goes to the Coliseum. We don't know what to do with it. We don't have an artistic specialist or anybody in the know-how at Oldham Council. So this money would basically be going to people who have no idea what to do with it, this £1.8 million. And additionally, there's also this £26 million brand new theatre that's meant to be built. They're promising by 2026. However, there's no actual legal obligation for them to deliver on this. And when you ask who is funding this £24 million new theatre space, people have been asking Oldham Council, who is funding this space? Like, we want a bit of transparency here. You basically just get a bunch of non-answers, really. Just a bunch of, this is what the plan is, this is the agenda for all the meetings. It's basically like a bot responded to these concerns. So with this brand new theatre space, this £25 million theatre space in Oldham, nobody actually knows who's funding it. So from the outside, and obviously I cannot say that this is actually happening, it's just the lack of transparency means that you've taken away the Oldham Coliseum for £1.8 million, and now you've gone over 10 times that amount of money to go to a brand new artistic endeavour in the community that you're not legally obligated to actually fulfil, and we don't even know where that £25 million has come from. Does it just it kind of almost looks like from the outside that Oldham Council has just given this money to their mates to maybe build this space, and the initial details for this space sound a little bit pants. I've been speaking to many journalists over the past few years because I wanted to learn more about this. I saw Christopher Eccleston on the news, I heard him on the radio, and I wanted to learn more about what was happening on my doorstep. I live in Salford. We're just a bit of a stone's throw from Oldham. So I wanted to know what was going on. So I reached out to many journalists, and I was inundated with several replies and responses from many passionate local advocates and local journalists in the area who are looking into this, and they had an awful lot of concerns, and they also do not know where the funding for this new Oldham Coliseum is allegedly coming from. So it almost looks like from the outside like some weird grift is going on, especially when you consider that you could have just spent a fraction of that money to uphold the institution of the Oldham Coliseum. It makes you wonder why on earth this is happening. And I was asking people, is this some sort of weird ideological thing? Because like I said, there is a culture in London of big theatre productions. The thing in London is that there is a culture around getting on the tube, going to a theatre production, and then going back on the tube as well that same night. That culture does not really exist as much in Manchester, especially in Oldham, where the public transport is really, really bad. Oldham is one of the most deprived areas in the north. I believe I read a statistic the other day saying that 60% of people in Oldham live below the poverty line. The Manchester average is 45%, which is still astronomically higher than it should be, but 60% for Oldham, it's a massively deprived area. So taking away the Oldham Coliseum, a community hub with 130 years of history behind it, seems like a real... it seems like something that is not a good idea to future-proof the institution of art and creativity in the north. And also, I didn't grow up in Manchester. I didn't grow up in the north. I've been here for just over 7 years now. I adopted the north, whereas you lot were born in it, moulded by it. I didn't experience my first deep-fried Mars bar till I was a man, and it was nothing but blinding. But I was in Lincolnshire. I came from the countryside, and it's only really now I kind of look back at how lucky I was, because I wanted to be an actor when I was younger, and just how lucky I was that I was able to pursue acting when I was younger. There's so many socio-economic barriers to getting into a creative industry, not just, of course, money-wise, where, maybe you have to go to an acting school, so many of which are based in London. And like, if you're in the north, it's expensive just to get a train ticket down or a bus down to London just to audition, let alone actually go there and live there if you want to be an actor. Christopher Eccleston, he says in the Radio 4 interview, we'll play the rest of it in a minute, he was very lucky that he got a bursary from Salford Council to go to RADA when he was younger. And even then, he was like the only northerner who went in that particular academic year that he was studying at RADA for. And he was the only person in his year to leave RADA after graduating without an agent, without representation. So there's a lot of economic barriers, of course, but also a lot of social ones. Like when I was younger, I used to do a panto in my local area. However, it was like a 10-minute car journey away to get to the rehearsals. Thankfully, I had parents with a car. I had parents who worked a 9 to 5. So when I came home from school and they came home from work, they could drop me off. They could drop me off at the theatre for a couple of hours. But what about parents who don't drive, or parents who work a nighttime shift, or more antisocial hours, things like that? Ideally, a great theatre production or a theatre establishment would be able to hire a bus service to be able to pick up its actors and its crew members before rehearsals begin. And that is such an obvious idea that would need funding, of course, like Taxpayers Council, but it would be worth it. But that seems like such a good idea. I guarantee you that something like that probably exists for acting schools in the south, in the more bougie communities. Deprived areas would need it most, but it wouldn't go to those areas. It would go to the people who have the contacts at, they would know somebody who knows somebody at Warner Brothers, or they would know somebody who, the nanny would be able to take them in, or something like that. They're all connected with each other. They're all on Jeffrey Epstein's plane, so they all know each other more or less. I'm being facetious, of course, but yeah, there was definitely a class divide and socio-economic barriers. And as Eccleston says in that interview, when you're from the north, you don't feel like the arts belong to you. You are kind of culturally shut out, or everything is, in terms of the higher up stuff and the entry level stuff, it is concentrated more or less in London and in select places in the north, and we're seeing those places in the north casually get eroded away. And when it comes to this brand new £25 million theatre in Oldham, we don't really have any sort of obligation for them to replace the new Oldham space. We don't even know who's funding this thing. We don't know if it's going to come to fruition. The early plans for this new Oldham Coliseum says that it's literally a performance space, no seating. It's just a space. It's just a building where creative stuff can happen. But you need seating. You need an auditorium for theatre stuff. You can't just have it be a literal space. And also, there's no plans for who would be the producers of this new Oldham Coliseum, who would be the production companies, who would oversee the day-to-day running, who would produce the productions, who would get the funding, things like that. None of that information is publicly available. And also, before Oldham Coliseum closed, a few weeks beforehand, they held a public forum where members of the Oldham Coliseum could talk to people about the funding from Arts Council England and others to try and get answers to their questions, try and figure out a way to maybe raise money and save the theatre. Do you want to know what happened? No one from Arts Council England turned up. It was a public forum for people to air their grievances or give constructive feedback to how they want their community to be served, how they want their community to be seen and grow and level up and develop. No one from Arts Council England turned up to that forum, which makes you wonder whether or not they are doing this maybe potentially for ideological reasons. And because there's so little transparency about this thing, it almost looks like there's an ideological bent to this decision. And also, there's a big thing happening in Manchester at the moment. Factory International. There's a big a brand new creative theatre space being built in Manchester right now. It's opening up this summer. They're having a big international opening festival in 2023. Janelle Monáe is going to be there, apparently. Loads of stuff. If you go to the bottom, Arts Creative England and Manchester City Council are the public sector partners here, so they're partly responsible for the funding. This thing sounds pretty cool, doesn't it? This thing is £100 million over budget, and when all is said and done, is expected to cost £210 million. but we can't put together 600k to keep the Oldham Coliseum open for another year. 1.8 million, all things considered, over the span of 3 years. Now, there's a great write-up in The Guardian by their arts correspondent Charlotte Higgins, who puts many of these numbers in perspective. Like, for example, it would cost 1.8 million to keep Oldham Coliseum open for 3 more years. The annual budget of Arts Creative England is 446 million. Rishi Sunak's Eat Out to Help Out scheme cost £849 million in a single month in 2020. And not only did it do nothing to help the hospitality industry, it even caused a boom in COVID infections in the summer of 2020. There's around £10 billion worth of COVID PPE fraud that the government just basically wrote off. That was £10 billion that was taken out of taxpayers' money and just written off by Rishi Sunak. Things like that. The money is absolutely there. When it comes to £446 million from Arts Creative England, that is a minuscule drop in the bucket compared to the general day-to-day spending of running a country. It's minuscule. It's a pittance. It is basically, to quote Boris Johnson, chicken feed, more or less. However, these things still get closed. These institutions still wind up being chiselled away piece by piece in the north, and they're going to be replaced by dubious facilities from unknown funding with no commitment to actually see these things brought to fruition. Now, Oldham is overseen by 2 Labour MPs. There's Oldham East and Oldham West. Over the past week, I looked at their Twitter feeds, and only one of them retweeted the Christopher Eccleston BBC Breakfast interview one time over the span of a week. The Oldham MPs are apparently completely asleep at the wheel on a big part of their local history and their local constituency and their legacy and their history. Completely asleep at the wheel on this, at least publicly. I can't really speak to what they're talking about behind the scenes, but it seems like the Labour MPs for Oldham West and Oldham East publicly can't give a shit. Now, there's also a great write-up here by Mark Chatterton, writing for Big Issue North. Now, Mark Chatterton is part of the Oldham alumni. He was an actor in Coronation Street. He could still be. I don't know. I don't watch Coronation Street. Writes up in Big Finish North, Oldham Coliseum is around 135 years old and has a treasured place in the hearts of Oldhamers and beyond. The theatre provides a considerable outreach programme. We heard all this awesome, it's good information, but for the sake of this segment, we're kind of repeating ourselves. This year, the theatre failed in its bid to maintain national portfolio organisation status with Arts Council England, which deemed the organisation, quote, risky and withdrew 100% of the funding, £600k a year, it needed to survive and continue producing work. In response, the theatre decided to close with immediate effect. Ace had £1.8 million ring-fenced for art and culture in Oldham and gave that money to the town council, which, by its own admission, doesn't know about theatre. Oldham Council also owns the theatre building, which is very old and some say beyond repair. However, in 2012, the Coliseum was given a grant of £2 million for refurbishment and renovation. It turns out that all the money was spent to give the building a further 10 years, during which the plan was to build a new theatre inside the old town hall. It seems odd that £2 million would be spent on a building that was known to be reaching the end of its life. The new proposed building came with £3 million worth of consultancy fees. The plans stumbled on, but were finally scrapped in 2018. That's an awful lot of money spent on basically nothing. At the same time, it's a very good write-up, but it basically shows that Arts Creative England and also Oldham Council don't really know what they're doing, at least in terms of the public-facing part of it. Like I said, this Factory International sounds cool. Got a brand new festival that's going to be starting up in the summer with some big-name talent. Is £100 million over budget. However, the Oldham Coliseum cannot get another 3 years of life. Let's keep playing some more from the BBC Radio interview with Christopher Eccleston.
That's what the Arts Council England is saying, is that there is going to be a new theatre in Oldham that's going to be opening in 2026, and meanwhile the money which would have gone to the Coliseum will be given to the council to fund other arts projects for the area.
What is this Radio 4 Today programme? Please keep banging on about that, because I'm going to bang on about that. And
Also, mad respect to Christopher Eccleston for doing this interview and not really knowing who he's speaking to. Is this Radio 4? Who is this? Where am I? I actually love, unironically, how he has the outward appearance of giving zero fucks.
Everybody who was there last night is going to keep But what's going to happen for the next 3 years to those communities that were served by Oldham Coliseum? That's my question.
You mentioned Maxine Peake, who's been campaigning a lot for the Oldham Coliseum. How do you find working with her?
We've worked together twice, and Maxine, like me, wouldn't be an actor without places like the Oldham Coliseum. We are from the Northwest. Maxine, like me, I think it's fair to say, didn't really feel she belonged in the arts, and the Coliseum spoke against that.
How easy do you think it would be for somebody from your background to become an actor today?
Pretty impossible nowadays. When I became an actor, God bless Salford Council, because I had no qualifications, and it's important to stress that acting is not an academic pursuit. It's a pursuit of the heart and the gut. You don't have to have gone to Oxbridge or public school to be an actor. What you need is imagination and emotion and passion. And I got from Salford, I got a discretionary grant because I'd secured a place at a so-called prestigious drama school. Nowadays, me coming out of Salford and Little Hulton, unless I have academic qualifications, I can't get a grant. So there's no more of actors like me coming through. It's impossible.
And how do you find it now looking for roles for yourself?
Well, that's not important. I mean, I'm 59. I've had my career. I've been very, very fortunate. It's not about me. It's about the younger generation, and the Oldham Coliseum is no longer there for them. And the pathway into the arts is not there for them in the way that it was for me in 83. And in 83, it wasn't great. But now, you've just got to go to public school, haven't you? You've got to be Oxbridge. Otherwise, you can't act.
And what about the kind of roles that are available for actors? I mean, I look back to our friends in the North, still hugely resonant today, but it was so interesting about the way it described class over a period of time. Do you think we're seeing the same kind of dramas today?
I hope so. I mean, what's been amazing about the industry is the changes that have happened with post-Me Too and post-Black Lives Matter. There's an argument, really, that when are we going to do the black, our friends in the North, or the brown, our friends in the North? There has been change, a lot of welcome change, but it seems to me that the same people are still in possession of power. And what I would say, I thought I was transgressing as a young person to become an actor. And I would say to people from my background, from council estates, I would say, don't plan to be an actor. Plan to be the director general of the BBC. Plan to be the director of the National Theatre. If you really want to change things, it's not by acting.
Is that what you're saying to your own daughter?
I wouldn't say anything to my daughter about acting or my son.
You would encourage them not to do it?
I wouldn't. It's not up to me what they do. It's up to them as individuals, isn't it? My job is to just be around and love them.
So astonishingly based Christopher Eccleston is, like especially the astute observation that, you know, when are we going to get a black or brown version of My Friends in the North, which was like a really influential drama in, what was it, the late 80s, early 90s. So yeah, it's a really good interview. I encourage you to listen to the full 20-minute thing on the BBC Sounds website. It's Radio North. I think it was the Saturday. I think it was actually on April 1st. Either way, you'll be able to find that on the BBC Sounds website and listen to the full thing. So yeah, it's pretty disheartening that these things are actually progressing backwards over the past few decades, where Christopher Eccleston is able to get a bursary, he was very lucky to be able to get a grant from Salford to be able to attend RADA. But now those opportunities, decades later, despite the fact that we should be progressing, that we should be leveling up, are now basically no longer available. And that we are regressing as a culture, we are regressing as a country, where people from outside of these privileged backgrounds who don't really need, who already have the connections, who already have the wealth and the socio-economic backgrounds to help them find these creative pursuits and these creative industries, they're also getting the extra legs up. It's Yeah, it's quite disheartening to see this happening in real time, and also just to have such a tangible example in Oldham on my doorstep. And like I said, I spoke to a lot of journalists over the past couple of days who reached out to me. Like I did a tweet just asking like if people wanted to talk, or like not necessarily talk on stream, but also to share what their thoughts were and to give me a bit more information, a little bit more context. I think the tweet only got like 5 or 6 likes. But then I was like bombarded with some really passionate advocates and journalists and everything in my DMs, which I really appreciate the time that if you're watching, I really appreciate the time that you spent putting up with my silly, dumb questions and surface level analysis and everything over the past couple of days. I do appreciate your time and your very lengthy correspondence, and clearly there's a lot of people very passionate about the topic and everything that's happening in Oldham. But like I said, it obviously there's going to be some government cuts and everything, even though people are spending more on taxes and council tax. Funding for everything is going down. It's almost as if that the Conservative government is treating the act of governing, the act of UK governance, as some sort of weird tunnel where you can funnel money to people who don't really need it. It's almost as if that's the intention of conservatism. But the cuts that are being made are like drops in the bucket, like drops in the ocean, like 1.8 million to keep Oldham going for 3 years, like round the clock, maintaining a communal hub for the area for £1.8 million. When Rishi Sunak can just like sneeze a £10 billion PPE fraud and just be like, yeah, that's fine. We can tank that blow to the economy. We can spend nearly £1 billion over the course of a single month for Eat Out to help out. That's absolutely fine. We're going to tank the UK economy with Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng to essentially try and develop Thatcherism, the idea that was never going to work the moment it touched oxygen, the moment it touched grass, so to speak. These are micro bits of funding. Like there was something. Now, this decision has actually been revoked by the BBC. There was an announcement a few weeks ago that they would be disbanding the 99-year-old choir, the BBC Singers. However, the BBC Singers, they're like a micro drop in the bucket in terms of the BBC's budget, and thankfully the outcry to BBC Singers was so huge. It's got a big international following, believe it or not. BBC Singers, this did eventually get reversed, but this is tiny in the grand scheme of things. Like BBC Singers, it's like £5 million. The BBC reportedly spent £110 million on the broadcast rights of the 2022 and 2024 Olympics. English National Opera has British taxpayers at £12.8 million per year. Contrast that for the Paris Opera, subsidised by the French state, to £88 million, €100 million. These are microscopic cuts that are being made, and because the cuts are so, relatively speaking, so small, but the impact culturally in the north and in these deprived communities is so big, it makes you wonder, is there an ideological bent to this? And obviously there's no public facing evidence to this, but it's one of those make it make sense things. Oldham Coliseum, you could fund this thing for £600k a year. No, actually, we're going to spend £24 million over the next few years to build a brand new performance space, but we don't know who's going to produce it. We don't know who's going to build it. We don't know who's going to look after it. Oldham Council, by their own admission, don't have anyone who has specialty in the arts, who don't know how to use the £1.8 million of funding that exists. It's there. It's in a pot. They just decided Oldham's not getting it. The theatre's not getting it. Tiny Man 2 Arts don't get money, well, which is once again further proof, should any more be needed, that Conservatives don't know how the economy works. Before Brexit, the UK car industry was the number one most profitable export in the UK. Since Brexit, it has now been usurped by the arts, by film, television, music and theatre. Understandably, it skews the metrics because that's a big umbrella. The UK arts are the biggest export that this country has, and the Conservative government defunds it at their own peril. However, once again, I think it's an ideological thing. Conservatives aren't really represented that much in the arts ideologically because their ideology is shit. That's why it doesn't really happen. There's not going to be a triumphant documentary about the Oldham Coliseum. Yeah, we took the funding away. There's not going to be there's not going to be a documentary triumphantly touting that message. There's going to be like an I, Daniel Blake equivalent. That's the art, like that's true conservative art. I, Daniel Blake, as in this is what conservatism does to a culture. And also, it's one reason why when you get GB News and Talk TV, you see conservatives disproportionately represented in like outlets like that, what's the term? News and current affairs, and also punditry and personality-driven news, in quotes, although Ofcom have recently said that GB News does not count as a news organisation, despite it having news in the name. Funny how that works. I wonder if there's a Tory in charge of Ofcom. Oh, wait, there is. So the reason that there's so much disproportionate conservative ideology in people in that field is because it takes relatively few people to make. Like, you can have a conservative podcast because it takes like a couple of people to make and edit and distribute it. You can have like GB News and Talk TV because you only need a couple of pundits to spout the same talking points day in and day out. Actually making TV, theatre, music, the creative endeavours generally, requires a collaborative effort. It requires people from different backgrounds and different walks of life coming together to create an end result, a product, for lack of a better term, to create an outcome, an end result that people can engage with and enjoy creatively, entertainment-wise, be educated by it, which is antithetical to conservatism, where it's basically every man for himself, which is why there's a much more liberal bias in the arts. Like, that's just how it pans out. Maybe don't have such a shit ideology, generally speaking. So, and because the arts, because media is such a big export for the UK, you underfund at your own peril. But there is also just a class element to who watches and engages with the arts as well, especially, theatre and musicals. For example, Hamilton's kind of like the big example. Hamilton, the musical by Lin-Manuel Miranda, it's like a massive big Broadway and West End hit. It's massive, it's huge, and it also utilizes like black culture and rap and that style of music and everything to sort of like reclaim that period of American history. And black people and brown people are disproportionately going to be disproportionately more likely to be from underprivileged backgrounds and weaker socioeconomic backgrounds. However, tickets for Hamilton sell for hundreds upon hundreds of pounds, which means that even the people who are represented by this art can't watch the art because there's such a financial barrier to watching it. And the arts should ideally belong to everybody. Ideally, the art should be a big communal thing. And that's what you had with Oldham, with the Coliseum. It's why you've had so many passionate people like Eccleston speak out about it. And it's gone now. 130 years, just gone. For what end? What goal? Why? Defroster Robot 77 has this segment been like 40 minutes. We're on the short end. I could honestly ramble on for even longer, but it's worth talking about. Like, as we see the erosion of the arts and of culture, Oldham Coliseum could in theory be revived. It could, yes. And it also shows that the outpouring of support and the fact that Oldham Coliseum was stacked to the rafters and was full, and was the building itself may need a bit of TLC, but it was able to accommodate a full crowd of people, and it was able to have these big names take part on the stage with like a Ken Loach, like I, Daniel Blake, a big writer, big name, Christopher Eccleston, Maxine Peake, big performers, still able to draw a crowd, and it's still able to resonate in a community. And it's worth doing. The demand is there. If they were to somehow balance the books better and fund Oldham, it would have a new lease on life. Gem97, no more local panto for the primary school kids. Yeah. Like, what about kids who, what about parents who can't afford to go into the city centre and pay for parking or fuel or whatever to watch the local panto? They've got to go a bit more locally, somewhere like Oldham, somewhere down the road, or somewhere that's a bit nearer and the parking's cheaper, or they could get the bus or whatever. But like I said, Oldham's a very deprived community. 60% of the people in Oldham live below the poverty line. It becomes a cyclical thing. It becomes a cycle. Poverty begets the poverty. Bolton has some great plans. Like every region, every borough should have something like Oldham Coliseum, and it should, more importantly, have the infrastructure to give the outreach to the community, to people who don't drive, people who can't use public transport. Like I said, there should be a bus that is able to pick up the actors. There should be that facilities there. There should be the TLC, the socio-economic contingencies in place to make the arts accessible to everybody in this communal space. And we're seeing these things get eroded outside of London. And maybe even I don't even know what's happening. I knew somebody who did lighting for a theatre and that got shut down, but that was a few years ago. I don't know the full situation. But yeah, and she says at the end, the only credible rescue mission at this point will come from an incoming Labour government. Their mission must not be flunked. But like, you're not seeing Labour's like not saying anything about this. They're asleep at the wheel. This is such an open goal for them. And Keir Starmer, he's so weak. He is so weak. Like, this is such an open goal. But they're silent. Even the Oldham MPs aren't saying anything about this. And when you have a culture of arts and creativity that is only made by the people who can afford to be in these situations and afford to be in these spaces and even like just have the contacts and the connections, then that ultimately influences the type of art that gets made, the type of people that get seen on screen, the type of stories that get told. And that ultimately trickles down into the culture. But instead, Starmer spent the last week throwing trans people on the bus because, of course, he has. Honestly, like, if you do all of the polling, only 1% of the UK population thinks that transgender, that like trans and LGBTQ, that demographic is an issue in the UK, which is kind of astounding. I had no idea that 1% of the UK wrote for The Spectator. But like, it's such a microcosm. It's culture war shit. It's shit that no one cares about. Even trans people and LGBT, like everyone in that umbrella, even they give less of a shit about these topics than the people advocating for the genocide. Whereas this stuff is happening on the doorstep, and no one's really talking about it. And that there's these promises that are being made. And if you are in Oldham or around Oldham, I think there's very little you can do on a personal level to enact change. But, you know, hounder and pester Oldham and be like, where is this funding coming from? Who's going to be producing it? If you are in Oldham, if you are a creative person in or around Oldham, start producing. If you can, rehearse theatre productions in your garden if necessary, because there might be an opening if this thing ever happens. But it's these grassroots advocacy efforts that are going to make or break the creative spirit of the UK in the near future. Because I believe that London should have a theatre community, should have a media infrastructure. It does, and it should have that. But I don't think that other areas of the UK should be deprived of that. Because there's so many distinct and interesting voices and people who maybe, I'm not going to say necessarily deserve platforms or deserve to have their stories told all the time, but I do believe that they should at least have a shot. That if that's what they want to do, they should have an opportunity to go for, to have their voice heard, to have their stories told. But as we're seeing the whittling away of creative infrastructures in the north, for seemingly no real financial reason, like I said, make it make sense. Like 1.8 million or this, like make it make sense. I'm not saying that Oldham is essentially using this as a way to funnel money to like construction workers or contractors or whatever to build something that has no actual creative infrastructure in mind. I'm not saying that that is happening, but because there's so little transparency about what's going on with this at the moment, it looks like that could be a thing. I'm not saying it is, but there's so little transparency that it could be, it feasibly could be. Oh, and who remembers that the government spent £100 million on the Festival of Brexit, which was an abject failure. Nothing came from it. Was there even a festival? No one cared, whatever. You could have... One second. Let's do some math. Government spent £100 million on a Festival of Brexit. 100 million. That's 1 million. That's 1 billion. 100 million divided by 600k. For one festival of Brexit, we could have funded the Oldham Coliseum for 166 years. Honestly, when you make these economic decisions, when you put it like that, I think the decision is pretty cut and dry as to what that money could have been spent on. I completely forgot about the Festival of Brexit. Yeah, because there's no creative, like, actual passion behind a project like that. It's just it's basically just faux patriotism. I know I'm rambling at this point, but I hope that I've made, at least in this segment, in this discussion, some sort of point. Or even if I haven't made a point, I've at least got you thinking about something that directly affects us. And if you do have a theatre company in the north or a production space in the north, look into it. We're seeing in the UK as well this push towards funding STEM projects, like STEM education, like science and technical topics and maths, and these are things that should be invested in for the education. But we also should not neglect things like English, not neglect things like drama. A few years ago, I was thinking I might want to become a teacher. There's no way I'd become a teacher. I'd be terrible at it. But I looked into it. However, there was no way that I'd be able to get a bursary to train to become a teacher unless I was teaching maths, unless I was teaching science or electronics. And I can't do those things. Ideally, I'd want to maybe teach something like English and then maybe move on to media and stuff like that. But because I couldn't get a bursary, it means that I couldn't afford to train to teach to do English and maybe even do drama and stuff like that. So once again, there's another class element that is a barrier between people working in useful and effective and life-changing for other people, like a great influential profession. And you're seeing a lot of like drama departments having their funding cut and their funding slashed. But I'll tell you, when I started learning to do drama, when I studied drama at GCSE and I did it at secondary school and stuff like that, and I did it at college, I learned so much, like just tangentially by learning drama. Like I learned about Greek mythology because we did a production on Oedipus. I played Oedipus. I did stuff to my mum and my dad, and I ripped my eyeballs out. It was an awful lot of fun. I learnt about rationing in World War One. I learnt about the potato famine. I learnt about women's suffrage. I learnt about all of these topics through drama. I learnt more about history and drama than I did actually studying to do an A-level in history, which is wild. I learnt all like this, and also just public speaking, confidence, social skills, things that drama instills in people. Like, I'm not a great public speaker because I and ah and I stammer all the time, probably as a result of the ADHD that I'm not diagnosed for, but I almost certainly have. But I would be a significantly worse public speaker if I didn't do drama. So I honestly think that drama, up until GCSE level, should be mandatory, just to teach you about like researching topics, reading and finding the narrative and the stories in history or in your local community, and just public speaking and performing or talking in front of people. That's a really effective skill, and it teaches empathy as you learn your way through these topics, and you learn about history and culture, and you learn it from other people. You learn this empathy. Empathy, believe it or not, is not some God-given thing that you're blessed with at birth. It's something you either have to be taught by these things, or if you're a conservative, you have it beaten out of you at a private school or something. There's so much under the umbrella of drama that applies to many other subjects. Like, even just like learning to put together a theatre production, and casting, and crewing, and budgeting, and working a lighting desk, and all of that good stuff. There's so many additional factors to drama that you'd be foolish to defund it in schools. But maybe that's the point. I think we need to make theatre an online medium as a backup just in case anything happens to real life ones. I actually do think that there should be more accessibility to theatre productions. Like they should film them. They should live stream them a lot more. I actually think, I mentioned Hamilton as an example, but I do think I'll give Disney Plus credit. I'll give Disney credit. Putting Hamilton on Disney Plus was a bloody stroke of genius. Like, not only on a business way, but it's just a general good. Like, tickets for Hamilton cost hundreds of pounds. Or if you're in New York, you enter into a lottery to maybe get a ticket, like a 1 in 1,000 chance. But putting Hamilton on Disney Plus, that was great. That's probably the only way I'll ever experience a show like Hamilton. But, you know, only companies like Disney or other big companies like Warner Brothers are able to foot the bill for that. But you see what's happening with the bloody Warner Brothers at the moment. I've kind of like rambled myself into a corner here now. I apologize, but this is something I wanted to talk about. I also think that it's worth fighting for, worth advocating for, even if it's not something that you are directly going to be involved in. I also kind of take issue with the BBC's framing of this. We're scrolling down to the bottom of the article. The current building is at the end of its life and performers, staff and audiences deserve better, council leader Amanda Chadderton has said. Amanda is the MP who actually retweeted a Christopher Eccleston interview on Twitter, and that is all she has said about the Oldham Coliseum over the past week on Twitter. Like, she's an MP for Oldham, she's bloody silent on this thing. She didn't even say anything directly, she just retweeted the BBC radio interview. Indeed, the council says the current building has problems with asbestos, poor accessibility and cramped backstage and front of house facilities. A £2 million renovation in 2012 was intended to give it another decade of use. But as we've read as well, that money didn't go to anything. Nothing happened with that £2 million. And like I said, I take issue with the framing of this. Like, you know, fair enough if the BBC writer Ian Youngs doesn't know about this, but you look into this thing. You don't just say, oh, it was given £2 million in 2012. That never that didn't transpire. They didn't do the restoration. Taylor, an audience member there, he and supporters are still holding out a slim hope of saving the current building. I'm not an architect, but I see old buildings restored. They say this building's not fit for purpose. Well, restore it then. Yeah, especially like there was the Stockport Exchange, which had a revamp for £2 million a few years ago. And that's a much way bigger space than the Oldham Coliseum. So imagine what a fraction of this £25 million new proposed building could do, and it will look boring. Look at it. It's grey blocks with a bit of red thrown in. This does not look like an inspiring centre. It's gonna make it look like the same thing that you'd build on The Sims. It's not a particularly inspiring version. I hate that. I'm not surprised the BBC framed this terrible. The current affairs department is terrible. Honestly, the news and current affairs department is what is dragging down the BBC at the moment. I know people who work in drama, documentaries, factual and stuff like that, and they're like, I have no idea what's happening in that department. People there are bloody crazy. I don't know what's going on there. We're gonna treat them like Hugo in The Simpsons. We lock them in the attic, we feed them fish heads, and we don't talk about them.